Our final topic for the semester then is looking at human evolution, issues concerning our own origins throughout the fossil record. And historically, if we look at the study of human evolution, it's been a pretty poor science. Because we're studying ourselves, ego certainly played a much bigger role in this area of science than what we would like to see. Remember, in science, we want to be objective, meaning we want the data to tell us what the answer is, as opposed to subjective, meaning I want to have an idea and then go prove myself true. Because if that's my approach, I can probably convince myself I'm right, because that's what I really want to do in the first place. And so a lot of egos have played a role in human evolution. In the last 50 to 75 years, though, we've seen a really drastic change in the study of human evolution, and today this is a very rigorous branch of science. They're doing hypothesis testing, looking at data, but because of the early studies, the study of human evolution actually is kind of behind a lot of other areas because of some of these early misconceptions. As we look at our own evolutionary history then, there's a lot we know, there's certainly a lot we don't know as well, so we're going to go through today and look at some of those different issues. If we start big picture first, though, humans are mammals, so we belong with the mammal group. So we're in the animal kingdom and the mammal phylum. We have protein-based hair and milk-producing mammary glands. Now, the mammals were around for a very long time. In fact, mammals were around for the bulk of the length of the time that dinosaurs were the dominant organism on our planet. But during that time, mammals were very small and relatively rare. We don't find a lot of fossils of mammals, but we do find a few around, so we know mammals existed. About 65 million years ago, though, is when we have the Cretaceous Tertiary, or KT, mass extinction. This is the last of our major mass extinctions in life's history. At this extinction, the dinosaurs went extinct, and we also see the appearance for the first time of most of the major mammal groups that we have today. Things like the hoofed mammals, like the artiodactyl, the cetaceans appear for the first time, the different groups of carnivores, and so on. And as we look at our different mammal groups, we're in the primate order, which we can see here. Some of our closer relatives within the groups of mammals are the rodents, which is probably a surprise, not probably what we think of when we think of ourselves. But primates appear for the first time about 65 million years ago. And as primates, we certainly share many characteristics with our relatives. So if we take a look at some primate characteristics here, all primates, except for us, are either totally or at least partially arboreal. And arboreal just means living in tree canopies or living in a rainforest or a canopy kind of situation. And living up in trees certainly is a very specialized habitat, a very specialized environment. And so there's going to be lots of adaptations then, or traits, that we're going to see in primates that help these organisms survive in this arboreal lifestyle. A couple of the more important traits or more obvious traits we certainly share with our primate relatives. One is that we have very, very good depth perception. That primates have very well-developed eyes. Not only that, but our eyes are located on the very front of our face, of our head. So our eyes are forward-facing, which allows for what's called stereoscopic vision. And stereoscopic vision just means if I look at something, I'm looking at it from two angles. I can see it with both eyes, and those two slightly different angles allow me to judge or perceive how far away it is. And so our depth perception in a large part has to do with our stereoscopic vision. And if you think it's not important, put an eye patch on or cover your eye and walk around for an hour or so, and you'll see it's very hard to judge distance with just one eye. Now, in addition to our stereoscopic vision, primates also have more of our brain devoted to our sense of sight, and so more brain power associated with interpreting our input that's coming from our eyes and deciphering that information. In addition to increased depth perception, primates also have prehensile hands, which means our hands are good for grasping and holding on. We have an opposable thumb. It's good for holding on to things, holding on to branches in particular. And many primates, in fact most primates, also have prehensile feet. Their feet have an opposable big toe that's good for holding and grasping onto things as well. And if we take a look at the primates, we see that there are two major groups. So our family tree of primates has kind of a major split. One of the major groups are called the prosimians. And the prosimians are some of the smallest primates, things like lemurs and lorises, tarsiers, for example. And if we look at some of these prosimians, like the loris here, or the lemur in this case, what we see is that these prosimians tend to be mostly nocturnal. Not all of them, there's some exceptions, but many of them are nocturnal, as we see with this loris. They often have very large eyes to help them see in the dark, and so a lot of times these prosimians have a very sort of cute baby kind of look, like you see with the kind of loris there. And most of these prosimians are obligate arboreal, meaning they have to spend most of their life in the trees and the treetops, and if they are not in the treetop, it's probably an accident, and they're going to try to return as quick as they can. And so they have very strong grasping hands and feet. Again, we can see that really nicely with the loris and lemur pictures here. Our other main branch in the primate family are the anthropoids. And the anthropoid certainly is the branch that includes us. It also includes other organisms like monkeys and apes, for example. And so if we look at anthropoids, by far the majority of the diversity or different species within anthropoids are the different species of monkeys, like we see with this langur here and her infant, or tamarins, for example, the kind of New World monkeys, or all the different spider monkeys are probably certainly the most diverse group within the monkeys even themselves. And so the anthropoids are mostly the monkeys, but we do see the ape family including humans, some Old World monkeys, some New World monkeys. And if we look at the anthropoids, what makes us different from those prosimians, we tend to start to spend some time on the ground, and so some arboreal, but we're starting to see more time spent on the ground. The ability to sit upright and be able to use your hands, and that I know doesn't sound like much of a change here, but the idea is if you can sit upright without holding on, then that frees up those hands to be able to use them as tools or for grooming or all kinds of different items here. And if we take a look then at the primate phylogeny or a phylogenetic tree of our primates here, what we see is our primates originated about 60 to 65 million years ago, again when most mammals groups appeared, that the prosimians branch off pretty early on, so they're pretty distant relatives within the primate group, and that the anthropoids represent a monophyletic group, that all of us anthropoids, the monkeys, apes, and humans, all can trace our ancestry back to a common anthropoid ancestor about 48 to 50 million years ago or so. Now within the anthropoids, we're certainly within the great ape family, which is our next destination. So we are certainly members of the great apes. The main distinguishing feature here within the apes is that we're the anthropoids that don't have a tail. So we lack any kind of real tail. Our forelimbs tend to be extremely long compared to the rest of our bodies as well. Today it's a pretty small group. There's only a handful of species alive, but historically this was probably a much more diverse group. And the Eocene epoch was about 20 million years ago, was probably when apes hit our peak of diversity, meaning our largest number of species. Not surprisingly, this was also a time when rainforests hit their peak, when we see rainforests as a dominant ecosystem on land. So lots of habitat for apes, lots of ape species. But over the last 20 million years, as the continents have moved around through continental drift, we've seen the environment change. And we've seen a gradual drying out of southern Asia and of Africa, so the rainforests are shrinking. Today, when we think of Africa, we probably don't think of rainforest or jungle. We probably think of the Sahara Desert or maybe the grasslands with all the wildebeest and the lions and the giraffes and so on. And so all those are very arid, dry sorts of areas. And so as the rainforests have gradually shrunk the last 20 million years, we've seen the ape diversity also decrease. So that now, again, only a few extant species, things like the gibbons, for example, orangutans, certainly gorillas, and chimps. And so not a lot of different diversity left within the ape family. Certainly if we think of our closest relative, who do we have the most in common with out there within the apes, it's obviously the chimps. And chimps and humans share about 98% of our genes are identical to each other, so we're very, very close relatives. Now that doesn't mean we came from chimps any more than it means chimps came from us. It means that we have a common ancestor that's with chimps that was neither a chimp nor a human, it was something else. Now obviously that 2% difference in our genes represents a big difference in our phenotype in terms of our behaviors and our features and so on. But we do see a lot of similarities if we look at our bone structure and our structure of our teeth, for example. We see a lot of similarities between chimps and humans. Even behaviors are very similar. Things like tool use and communication. Now certainly humans take them to a very big extreme compared to chimps, but we see these basic behaviors even in chimps. And if we keep tracing our evolutionary history kind of closer and closer to present time, eventually get to the hominin branch. And the hominins are basically all the humans within the branch of the ape family. So once humans and chimpanzees, our common ancestors, split, everything after that in our family tree we would say were hominids. And we know that our branch of the family tree split from the chimp's common ancestor somewhere between about 5 to 7 million years ago. And that date is based on a very limited amount of fossils. We don't have many fossils during this time, but also based on our similarities in DNA, we know that split was relatively recent in geological time. Now we know there are lots of gaps in the fossil record, especially for organisms that live on land. And live in jungles and rainforests where it's moist and warm, and things tend to degrade very quickly. They don't leave behind many fossils. And unfortunately, kind of the area we're most interested in, well, what did those early humans look like? What was the difference that kind of split us from the rest of the apes? There are gaps in the fossil record, and we do find some fossils, but they tend to be just teeth or bits of jawbone. We certainly haven't found enough to recreate that original sort of hominid that we might expect to see. But one thing we do see over time after that split is our family tree is very bushy. Today we have one species of human, ourselves, but historically we've had many species of humans, oftentimes many hominids all coexisting at the same time, but we've also seen lots of extinction, lots of speciation along the way. Now, we know the major species that existed, and by major I mean these are species that we find a significant number of fossils for and that existed for a long period of time. But we don't necessarily know how they're related. Remember, the fossil record gives us good information on speciation and extinction and diversity, but it doesn't give us much information on relationship. And so, as we go through today and look at our hominid branch of the ape family tree, we're going to look at some of these major species. But I don't want to imply that one led to another because we really don't know relationships for sure. Okay? But here is our original split here with the chimps, and we can see that the chimps split from kind of our common human ancestor about 5 to 7 million years ago, that these early hominins were the species of Australopithecus. Even within our own family branch, notice there was a major split. There were several species represented by R that stands for robust, and other species represented by G, which stands for gracilis, which is more of a light-boned organism. And it's thought that what made our branch of the family tree different than the other branches is that as the rainforests were drying up, we were the group of apes that left the forest and moved into the grasslands. And moving into the grasslands, then it's thought, moving into a different habitat, we see very kind of fast evolutionary change in some of our external features compared to chimps. And if we look at food, there were two major food sources. Some organisms tended to eat food that were easy to get, and most of these primates, including early hominids, were all vegetarians, all eating just plants and fruits and nuts and so on. And the R stands for a group of species that were robust, and robust organisms tend to have big, thick, heavy jaws, lots of teeth. They tend to be grazers. They ate a lot of plant material that's easy to find, but low in nutrients, things like leaves and grasses, for example. And there were several species, and we noticed they all went extinct. That was kind of an evolutionary dead end. The other branch, early on in hominin evolution, were much lighter boned, and those were organisms that went for food that was much harder to find, but had more nutritional value, things like nuts and berries and so forth. And it's thought that one of those species eventually led to our own species of modern humans. So a good place to start looking at our hominid branch are the species of Australopithecus. And the Australopithecus is a whole group of species, anywhere from maybe 5 to 8 different species that all coexisted at different times in Africa. And these species first appear about 4 million years ago, and that's when we get enough fossils where we can really start to piece together our history. And the last of the Australopithecine went extinct about 1 million years ago or so. And these fossils are all found in the easternmost region of Africa and some on the southern tip of Africa. So we know that Africa was certainly sort of the cradle of human life, or the beginnings of most of our major species. Now in terms of, well, what did they look like? What made us or our early ancestors different from the apes? It was not our brain size, and that's a common misconception. Sometimes people think, well, we're a lot smarter than the apes, so we should see an ape with a big brain, that's us. But the reality is the first Australopithecine had a relatively small brain, very similar to the brain size we see in chimps today. But what made us distinctly different from the apes was how we walked, and that movement was bipedal movement. And so walking upright was really what made us different than the rest of the chimps and all the ancestors within the apes. Now compared to modern humans, we're much smaller, probably averaging in that kind of 3 to 4 feet tall or so, and so much more diminutive, but walking upright. And it's thought that walking upright was an adaptation to living in the grasslands, that maybe it allowed us to see further, it allowed us to move, to walk while carrying things like our young or carrying food, and also to move much faster to escape predation, for example. Probably the most famous fossil in all of human evolution is Lucy. And Lucy is a fossil discovered by Don Johanson in the mid-1970s in the Great Rift Valley in kind of the very eastern part of Africa. And here's a picture of Lucy's bones. Here's a picture of Lucy compared to a modern human. And Lucy is a member of a species called Australopithecus afarensis. The Afar region is a region in Africa, so that she's named after the region she was found in, and she's dated at about 3 million years old. And the reason Lucy is such an important fossil in terms of this human evolution in our story here is that she's the oldest, most complete Australopithecus that we have. And so again, typically when we find fossils, we might find bits of a jaw or some teeth or some ribs, but here we find most of the major bones. And if we take a look at Lucy, here she is this gold mine, and yet still about half the bones are missing. And so we never find a whole fossil, again, of the whole organism. We just are finding bits and pieces. Now, we got lucky with Lucy because, for example, we see her one femur bone is present, the other's missing. Well, we can assume her other side of her body looks the same, and so we can kind of infer what the other side might look like. And that's what they did in this picture comparing Lucy to modern humans. And the gray bones represent the bones that we found with Lucy. The light-colored or white are inferred based either on, we'll assume the right looks like the left, or in case of her skull, notice most of her skull is missing, we have several other fossils of this species in this area, so we kind of already knew what her skull looked like. And if we compare Lucy to a modern human, some of the things that jump out at us, obviously the skull is really different. She has a very small brain compared to modern humans. Look how big and thick and heavy her jaw is. And again, that's indicative of an organism that eats more plant material. Her arms are really long compared to the rest of her body in modern humans. Her chest, her ribs are more funnel shaped. They kind of flare out at the end versus modern humans, which is more of a barrel or cylindrical kind of shape. And so basically from the waist up, she has all characteristics that are very ape-like. But from the waist down, she looks very much like modern humans. Her hip bones, her leg bones, all show that she was walking upright. Not only did she have the right anatomy, but we know from fossilized footprints from a place in Laetoli, Africa, which is about 600 miles away from Afar, where Lucy was found, there are fossilized human footprints dated at about 2 to 2.5 million years old. So we know that modern humans, we know that Australopithecus, our ancestors, were walking upright a very, very long time ago. And again, that was kind of the first distinctly human trait that we see in the fossil record. And the different species of Australopithecine kind of came and went. There were extinctions and speciations, many different species, all in that eastern and southern Africa. Eventually then we see our own genus, Homo, appear. About 2.5 million years ago, we start to see fossils that are similar enough to modern humans that we would put them in our same category of our same genus. And we know that we descended from one of these species of Australopithecus, but we really have no idea which one. It probably wasn't Lucy's species from the last slide, the afarensis, because her species was extinct before we see these modern humans sort of arise. And there are many species within our genus, maybe as many as 10 to 12 different species, and new species are being discovered on a regular basis as we get better at finding and identifying fossils. But I want to talk about 4 major species, and these are listed from oldest to youngest: Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalensis, and then finally modern humans, Homo sapiens. And again, I don't want to imply one led to the next because we don't know that by any means, but again, just looking at some basic traits, what did our ancestors look like at different periods in our history? So if we start with Homo habilis literally translates into handyman. And so not surprisingly, with these fossils of Homo habilis, we also find fossilized evidence of our first use of stone tools. And so these stone tools are very, very primitive. So if you're thinking of arrowheads and spears, that's way, way too complex. What we see basically are rocks that have been shaped and beaten so that they form something that might fit in the palm of your hand that you could use to smash and grind plant material, for example. Or maybe rocks that have been split up into little shards, and the little shards of the rock then can be used to cut different things. And so very primitive stone tools. Now, chances are our ancestors were using tools way before Homo habilis. But if organisms use tools, like a stick, for example, and then they drop that stick is going to make a fossilized stick. It won't look like a tool. So this is the first time, though, that we see the environment being modified in a way that when we find a tool, we can clearly say this is man-made. The environment could not have made this shape. And so, again, our first evidence in the fossil record of tool use here. Now, Homo habilis coexisted with several species of the Australopithecine in Central Africa. This was a pretty long-lived species. We see habilis fossils lasting about 500,000 years. and always in Africa. We never see any of these outside of our African continent. Now, based on their teeth, and teeth are our most common human fossil because teeth are our hardest bone, our hardest structure, so they make the most fossils. But based on their teeth and their toolbox, probably not accomplished hunters. So again, if you're thinking of cavemen running around chasing big game, that's not Homo habilis by any means. They certainly could have eaten animals and been opportunistic in terms of what they ate, but certainly not out there hunting large mammals or large prey items. The next major species in the fossil record is Homo erectus, which is probably the longest lived of all the different species that we see. It was around the longest. Now, Homo erectus stands technically for upright man, and it's kind of a misnomer because this fossil was the first fossil found after Darwin's book, after people started looking for possible human ancestors, and they found this fossil, and it was clearly the first fossil that was found that was not modern human, but was walking upright, and so it was named Homo erectus. Now, we know that our species, though, had been walking upright for a couple million years before this species ever appears, and so that's why it is a misnomer. But because of its historical significance, the name is kind of stuck, so we still call it Homo erectus here. Now, it was around for almost 1 million years, so again, a very successful, long-lived species. This is the first hominid that we see migrate out of Africa. So up until about 1 million years ago, all fossils of hominids are only in Africa. But Homo erectus is the first to migrate out, and they migrated out of Africa in waves into Asia and then eventually into Europe and throughout the Old World. So we first see our evidence of kind of humans as travelers and explorers with Homo erectus. Now the toolkits continue to become more advanced. Their hand axes, they start to grind stone tools into specific edges, for example, to use as scrapers or to use to cut things. We see specific tools used. So for example, we'll find a stone tool made from a rock that doesn't exist within several hundred miles from that area, which tells us that either they were traveling to get specific rocks to make very specific intricate tools, or there was some sort of trade network between different groups of Homo erectus that they were trading different rocks to make very specific types of tools. Next up are the Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalensis, and they were around from about 230,000 to about 30,000 years ago. And this is getting really close, right? We have recorded history from, we think, Egyptian and Sumerian texts from about 15,000 years ago, so we're almost to recorded history when the Neanderthals finally go extinct. Now, compared to modern humans, Neanderthals are shorter, stocky, and more powerful. They have thicker bones. Based on their muscle attachment places on their bones, we know that they had more powerful muscles. Now, this is characteristic of organisms that tend to live in cold environments, being shorter and being stockier, and so not surprisingly, the Neanderthals, the time frame when they were around, was a time of many ice ages, and so the Earth was a much cooler climate. These were some of the first really, truly cave dwellers that lived in caves. Now, typically when someone calls you a Neanderthal, it's not meant to be a compliment, it's meant to be an insult, as if there's something wrong with your brain, or you can't think correctly, or you're dumb, or that sort of thing. In reality, Neanderthals have a very large brain case. In fact, their average is really close and slightly larger than the average modern human brain size. So they did have large brains. Now, looking at a fossil, that can tell us how big a brain is. It certainly doesn't tell us how the brain was wired or what they thought. So we don't know exactly what some of their thought processes might have been, but we do know that they certainly had the capability, based on their brain size, to have some pretty advanced brain tissue and thought. With the Neanderthals, we see toolkits becoming more intricate and more advanced. For the first time, we see another common human trait, that idea of a system of belief, appear in the fossil record. A lot of times these Neanderthals are found laid out very specifically with specific tools around them, so we see a ritualistic burial for the first time in some of these caves. Last then are modern humans, Homo sapiens. And modern humans are sometimes called Cro-Magnon man because some of the oldest fossils first discovered were of modern humans were found in the Cro-Magnon region, which is a southern region in France. And so if you see that term Cro-Magnon, that just means modern humans here. We first appear in the fossil record about 200,000 years ago or so for the first time. Again, we have African origins. All the oldest fossils are found in Africa. Then we see migration to the rest of the world. Compared to other hominin species, we see clothing becoming more elaborate, tools more elaborate. We see our first evidence of art. The cave paintings in southern France, for example, date to about 25 to 35,000 years old. There's a couple of deer femurs that are engraved and carved that date to be about 15 to 20,000 years old. We know we have an African origin, again, based not only on the fossil record, but based on our DNA evidence. If we compare DNA of all modern humans, we're almost closely related to people that live today in Africa, which tells us that was our center of origin. And then gradually, modern humans migrated throughout the world and replaced Neanderthals. And so we have this kind of coincidental thing going on. As the Neanderthals are going extinct throughout the old world, modern humans are replacing them. Now, there's lots of interesting hypotheses and stories about that interaction. Did the Neanderthals go extinct as the Earth was warming up and we simply moved into the old neighborhood after they were gone? Did modern humans show up and outcompete Neanderthals, and so we kind of drove them to extinction? Or was there some sort of warlike interaction? Did modern humans actually kill off the Neanderthals? And the reality is, we just simply don't know. There's just not enough evidence to evaluate that interaction. But we know that these two things at least were going on at about the same time. Neanderthals going extinct as modern humans migrated and replaced them throughout the old world. And if we look at our human migration pattern, again, what we can see is our center of origin is in eastern Africa about 200,000 years ago. And then we see waves moving out of Africa and into Asia, one branch into Europe, another branch into southern Asia and the Pacific Rim, and then the other branch finally into the New World. And so whereas we have fossils of humans dating back to about 4 to 5 million years ago in Africa, our first evidence of any humans in North and South America is only about 15 to 30,000 years ago, so very, very recent. In addition, along with these major migrations of modern humans, we also see our first mass extinctions associated with humans. For example, in Australia, there were a whole series of large marsupial mammals that existed, a large mammal fauna, and as modern humans arrived there about 50 to 40,000 years ago, we see a wave of mass extinctions of these large mammals. In North America, we had our own selection of large mammals, and as modern humans moved down the North American continent from about 30,000 years ago to about 15,000 years ago, we see a wave of mass extinction of those large mammals kind of coinciding with that. And the idea is that in both Australia and the Americas, as modern humans arrived for the first time, humans didn't exist in these places before, with our large brains and our modern toolkit, very accomplished hunters, those large mammals didn't stand much of a chance, and we wiped them out very quickly. And it's not a coincidence that today the only place in the world where we still find large mammals existing is in Africa, where humans originated. So the idea is that as humans gradually over millions of years became smarter, became better hunters, developed better tools, animals in that region co-evolved better ways to avoid humans, to avoid predation. And so that's why they exist where humans have existed the longest. But when we arrive in these areas for the first time, modern humans with our toolkits and our hunting abilities, those large mammals were wiped out relatively quickly. And as I mentioned before, we as hominids have a very bushy family tree. And what I mean is, if we were to look at some of these different species throughout time here, and if we were in Central Africa, let's say about 2 to 2.5 million years ago, there were probably as many as 4 or 5 different species all coexisting at the same time. Now these groups or fossils are all found within 4 to maybe 600 miles from each other. We really don't know how they interacted. Did they communicate together? Did they interact? But we do know they all coexisted. And so just because we're the only hominid species left today, that certainly isn't the case in the past, that we've had lots of species, but lots of extinction, and that today we're the only species that's still alive. If we summarize in our information, again, we haven't filled in all the missing pieces by any means, but if we look at human evolution, we have enough fossils to see some of the major trends. And if we look, our thing that makes us distinctly human is our bipedal movement, walking on 2 legs, not using our front arms or our front legs basically to walk. We never see a large brain pop up in the fossil record where all of a sudden we've got this really large brain on an organism. Instead, what we see is a gradual increase of brain size throughout our evolutionary history. And so our chimps have a brain about 1/4 as big as humans, and we see that gradually getting bigger throughout our family tree. We see several features of the skull becoming smaller and less prominent. For example, the brow ridge, which is the bone right below your eyebrow. If you rub your eyebrow, you can feel a little bump back there. In other apes and in our ancestors, that was the top of the skull, and that was really prominent and large, and that indicated a place where lots of muscles attached. But as our forehead has gotten taller, our brow ridge has decreased in its prominence. So again, as our brain case has gotten bigger, that brow ridge has gotten smaller. We see tool use becoming more refined and more intricate and more specialized over time. And we see a change in our diet. That early hominids were almost strictly herbivorous to today we're more omnivorous, meaning we'll eat a mixture of animals and plants. And so as we've seen that change, we've seen a change in jaw structure and in tooth structure as well, as we see this change in our diet from herbivorous to more an omnivorous diet.